What if everything you thought you knew about a story was only half the truth? Today, Ibrahim Traoré uncovers a hidden chapter of Charlie Kirk's life that the world was never meant to see. Stay with us as we unravel secrets, betrayals, and revelations that will shock you and inspire you. Before we dive in, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a story that challenges everything you think you know. Now let's step into the shadows and see the truth revealed. The air was thick with silence, the kind of silence that hides something unspeakable. A single bulb flickered above the worn concrete walls of an archive buried beneath Ouagadougou, its shadows stretching like claws across stacks of dust-choked boxes. Each box carried a seal, each seal a warning. Restricted. Do not open. Ibrahim Traoré stood still, his hand hovering above one particular folder marked in red. He had seen documents before, reports, briefings, lies dressed as facts, but this was different. The paper smelled of rot, the ink half faded, as though the words themselves had tried to escape. And yet, in their fading, they whispered. Buried within the faded script was a name no one expected to find here. Charlie Kirk. Not in the context the world knew him, not as the image projected under lights and cameras, but in a chapter scratched out, hidden, deliberately erased. Someone had wanted this buried, so deep it would never be unearthed. Why here? Why Africa? Why him? The silence pressed harder. The questions pulsed like war drums. And behind the weight of each page, behind each redacted line, was something far darker than he could have imagined. Threads tying continents together. Voices silenced. Betrayals that stretched across oceans. As he flipped the pages, something began to emerge. Not a story of one man, but of a network, of influence cloaked in shadows. There were missing dates, coded entries, testimonies crossed out in thick black ink. But fragments survived, enough to paint a picture, a link between struggles his people had endured and decisions made thousands of miles away. Traoré's eyes burned. The deeper he read, the colder the room became. These were not just documents, they were wounds, reopened decades later, bleeding truths into his hands. And then, on the last page, the writing stopped mid-sentence. A cut. A deliberate silence. Something had been torn away. He realized now he was not just reading a file, he was trespassing on something someone had killed to keep, hidden. What he uncovered was never meant to see the light of day. The torn page haunted him. Words cut off in the middle of a sentence, as if history itself had been censored with a blade. Ibrahim Traoré slid the fragment back into the folder, his mind circling like a hawk. Every instinct told him this was not merely an omission, but a warning. An invisible line drawn by forces who did not forgive trespassers. Still, he could not stop. The following days became a blur of restless nights and restless travels. He moved through dim corridors of neglected libraries, courthouses where records were kept under dust and disdain, and guarded offices where whispers carried further than shouts. Each document, each testimony, pulled him deeper into a labyrinth where fact and fiction intertwined. It was in an abandoned colonial building, half swallowed by weeds, that he stumbled across the first clue no redactor's pen had touched. In a pile of weather-worn reports, he found a letter sealed in wax. Its edges were brittle, its script written in a hurried hand. The message spoke of youth movements rising in the West, of money flowing in rivers unseen, of influence wielded with precision. And there in the margins, a name resurfaced, Kirk, not as a bystander, not as an outsider, as a thread woven into decisions that reached far beyond what the world believed. A chill ran through him. This was no coincidence. Each lead led to another shadow. Each shadow revealed a face blurred beyond recognition. Anonymous men in tailored suits, unnamed institutions with hands in every conflict, financiers whose signatures never appeared but whose influence scarred entire nations. They had rewritten stories before. They had buried voices before. And now, it seemed, they had erased a chapter that connected America's political theater to Africa's bleeding soil. As Traoré pieced together fragments, the story darkened. He discovered transcripts of speeches never delivered, plans that dissolved before reaching the stage. He unearthed testimonies from men who vanished weeks after speaking, women whose letters were intercepted, families who disappeared without trace. Their words hinted at an alliance forged in secrecy, one that fed unrest abroad while presenting smiles at home. The deeper he searched, the more his surroundings shifted. Soldiers at checkpoints began asking unnecessary questions. His own advisors grew cautious, their eyes carrying an unease they would not voice aloud. Strangers followed him in crowded markets, too close to be accidental, too silent to be harmless. The truth was no longer confined to paper. It was alive, watching him, resisting him. Nights grew longer. Sleep became scarce. He would sit beneath the dim glow of a lantern, reassembling torn fragments, chasing names across borders, drawing lines between the whispers of Africa and the thunder of America. And always, the same silence greeted him in the end, a chapter ripped away, a truth smothered before it could scream. But there was something undeniable now, a pattern carved into the void itself. Whoever tore out these pages underestimated one thing. Fragments still spoke. Even ashes left behind a trail of smoke. And the smoke was leading somewhere, toward a revelation too vast to be coincidence, too damning to be ignored. What he held was not history. It was dynamite, hidden under the guise of dust, and the hands that once buried it were stirring again. The fragments led him far beyond the borders of his land. Traoré boarded worn trains that rattled through empty deserts, crossed airstrips under false pretenses, and stepped into cities where every shadow seemed to recognize him before he arrived. He was no longer a soldier at the head of a nation. He was a pursuer of ghosts, chasing the echo of a chapter that men had killed to conceal. In Europe, he entered basements where documents were sold like contraband, where smugglers traded in memory itself. There he found shipping manifests, coded with numbers that did not correspond to goods but to names. Names of young men moved like pieces across continents, ushered into movements, shaped into instruments of power. In one margin, scribbled hastily in pencil, the words appeared again. Kirk approved. The handwriting was hurried, terrified, as if written in a rush before the writer's hand was forced to silence. In the heart of a coastal African city, he met an old archivist whose hands trembled as he unlocked a trunk that had not been opened in decades. Inside lay a stack of tapes, reels corroded but intact enough to play. Through static and distortion, voices emerged, strategies whispered in American accents, decisions made over maps of African soil. One voice stood out, steady, youthful, persuasive. It spoke not of politics as the world saw it, but of influence as a weapon. A voice that linked Charlie Kirk not to speeches and rallies, but to shadows that stretched across the continent. Each discovery pressed on him with the weight of inevitability. The story was not about one man, but about a machinery of influence that required silence, demanded obedience, and erased any who resisted. But as he uncovered more, the danger grew thicker. His convoys were followed by black vehicles that appeared and vanished with uncanny precision. Informants turned cold, their tongues locked by fear or bribes. A letter was slipped under his door, unsigned, carrying only a single line. "You are chasing ghosts that will consume you." Yet he pressed forward. The suffering of his people haunted him. The mothers holding lifeless children in empty hospitals. The farmers watching fields die under promises of foreign aid that never came. The soldiers who looked at him with eyes begging for a reason to keep fighting. He saw in their hunger the fingerprints of the very system he was uncovering. The erased chapter was not just a historical curiosity. It was alive, its consequences written in the hunger of his nation. And then came the betrayal. One of his own aides, a man he had trusted with access to his notes, vanished overnight. Days later, entire boxes of files disappeared from a secure vault. Soon after, radio stations across the region began broadcasting a campaign against him, painting him as reckless, unstable, even dangerous. The very networks he had suspected now moved against him openly, twisting his pursuit of truth into a tale of madness. The walls closed in. His circle shrank, yet with every piece stolen, he remembered the fragments he had already seen, the outlines of a truth too vast to erase. In a hidden room beneath a crumbling monastery, he found the clearest clue yet, a diary belonging to a defector, its pages soaked with fear. The diary spoke of meetings where Kirk's name was invoked not as a man, but as a symbol, a youthful mask for something far older, a vessel for strategies designed to mold nations, silence movements, and direct the flow of history itself. The revelations piled higher, and so did the danger. He was running out of allies, running out of places to hide, but he had crossed a point of no return. Now only one choice remained: bring the suppressed chapter into the light, or let the silence win again, and silence had ruled for too long. The storm broke just as Traoré reached the abandoned embassy on the outskirts of the city. Rain hammered the cracked pavement, washing away the dust of 1,000 footsteps, but not the weight of what he carried. Inside, under flickering fluorescent lights, the final pieces of the chapter awaited. Files stacked in haphazard towers, reels of film cracked and curling, letters tied in fading ribbons. Each one held a key to the story the world had been denied. He moved carefully, aware that every shadow could conceal a watcher, every echo could carry betrayal. And they were here. He could feel it, the pulse of hidden eyes, the breath of unseen pursuers brushing against the walls. Yet he pressed forward because the truth, once glimpsed, demanded courage, demanded recklessness, demanded sacrifice. He began piecing together the last fragments, arranging papers on a long table, the edges soaked with rain dripping from his sleeves. A pattern emerged. Names, dates, decisions, all interconnected, like a spider's web stretching from boardrooms in America to villages in Africa, threading through youth movements, aid programs, and silenced dissidents. And at the center, like a hidden signature, Charlie Kirk's name appeared, not as a figurehead, but as a node of influence, a puppet master in plain sight. The revelation hit him like lightning. The hidden chapter was more than a story. It was a map of power, manipulation, and unseen consequences. It exposed alliances that had quietly steered lives and nations, erased voices that had fought to speak. And it revealed the depth of betrayal, how decisions made far away had shaped suffering at home, and how silence had been enforced with meticulous cruelty. Then came the confrontation. Men in dark suits emerged from the shadows, faces impassive, weapons drawn, not guns, but documents, threats, insinuations, the invisible arsenal of influence. They had tracked him here, anticipated him, tried to close the circle before the chapter could see daylight. Traoré stood firm. There was no room for hesitation. The storm outside mirrored the storm in his chest. Minutes stretched like hours. The men offered compromises, threats, half-truths. Traoré countered with fragments of evidence, a relentless stream of logic and proof. He laid out the story they wanted buried, letting the documents speak for themselves. Each revelation struck like thunder. They could not deny the patterns, the names, the hidden connections that had shaped history in shadow. Some faltered. Some tried to persuade him to stop, to hide what he had uncovered, to let the silence reign. But he would not. His eyes burned with the weight of the forgotten, the wronged, the hungry, the silenced. And with each passing moment, the tide turned. By the time the first rays of dawn pierced the storm clouds, the chapter was revealed. The men in shadows retreated, their power broken not by force but by exposure. The documents were copied, the reels preserved, and the story, long suppressed, long silenced, was finally alive. Traoré stepped outside, rain washing over him, and for the first time in weeks he breathed freely. Across the horizon the city awoke, unaware yet of the truths now circulating quietly, invisibly, but irreversibly. He knew this was only the beginning. The world would resist. The world would challenge him, but the suppressed chapter had escaped the grave. And in that moment, he understood something profound. One man's courage could illuminate centuries of darkness. The storm had ended, but the revelation would ripple far beyond the embassies, the archives, and the shadows that once controlled it. Even in a world built on secrets, one truth, once uncovered, could change everything. The dawn after the storm was quiet, almost serene. Yet beneath the calm ripples of revelation had begun spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated. News traveled in whispers at first. A hidden chapter of a story the world thought it knew had been uncovered. Then in flashes, headlines, reports, encrypted messages, murmurs in cafes, halls of power and marketplaces alike, Ibrahim Traoré watched it all unfold, a faint smile breaking the tension that had weighed on him for weeks. The suppressed truths were no longer locked away. Across nations, people began to stir. Activists in cities far from Burkina Faso found courage in the fragments he had revealed. Conversations once silenced grew louder. Scholars and journalists pieced together the puzzle, connecting dots previously invisible. Children learned not just of heroes, but of the forces that had tried to shape their world in shadows. The narrative was shifting, and it carried the heartbeat of a continent finally reclaiming its place in a story that had long excluded it. Traoré walked through the streets of his city, observing faces etched with struggle, but now flickering with recognition. Mothers nodded to him as if they understood, even without words. Soldiers, once doubtful, now moved with renewed purpose. The oppressed had a narrative to fight back with, and it was no longer whispered, no longer hidden. It was alive, and it was theirs. Those who had tried to bury the chapter had faltered. The networks of influence, once meticulous and untouchable, had been exposed. Their authority crumbled not through battle or violence, but through the undeniable force of truth. And in the ruins of secrecy, new alliances began forming. Alliances not of manipulation, but of awareness, accountability, and a shared pursuit of knowledge. Yet Traoré understood that revelation alone was not victory. The chapter he had uncovered was a spark, but the fire had to be carried by many hands. He met with thinkers, leaders, and ordinary citizens, sharing the story, guiding its interpretation, and inspiring courage. Each retelling ignited new understanding, new reflection. Africa, long shaped by decisions imposed from afar, now found itself shaping the conversation. Its voice was no longer hidden in footnotes or redacted files. It was central, undeniable, essential. And in the quiet moments, Traoré reflected on his own journey. The fear, the nights of uncertainty, the betrayals, each had forged him into something greater than he had been. Not just a seeker of truth, but a guardian of it. The burden of history had fallen on him, and he bore it with dignity, knowing that courage was measured not by survival, but by persistence in the face of darkness. As the sun set over the city, painting the sky with hues of gold and fire, a sense of hope took root. The chapter that had been suppressed had become a beacon. The story was no longer confined to the pages of secret files. It flowed in conversations, in classrooms, in the eyes of those who dared to dream of a world free from manipulation. And Traoré asked himself, quietly, almost rhetorically, if one hidden chapter could shift the course of nations, how many more truths lie waiting, buried in silence, ready for someone brave enough to uncover them? He did not need an answer. The people around him were already carrying it forward. The chains of secrecy had been broken, and the world, finally, had seen a glimmer of what courage and truth could accomplish. Ibrahim Traoré had revealed what others had tried to hide. And in doing so, he had changed not just a story, but the course of history itself.